Welcome everyone to the Citizens Climate Lobby Canada June 2020 education call. I am not facilitating tonight. John, Sharon are facilitating, and we have two guests tonight from the Pembina Institute, Isabelle and Nichole, and I will let John take over from now, and I'm going to work tech behind the scenes. Thank you, everyone.
Hello, hello. Can anyone see me? Hello,
Yep.
hello, hello.
We can hear you.
You can hear me, but what's wrong with my picture?
We can see you.
You can see me. Am I on full face, Isabelle?
Well, on my screen, you're not the main screen, but I can see you if I choose to be the first series of photos.
Oh, okay. Well, anyway, let's get into this and hopefully everything will work out. Well, welcome everyone to tonight. You're going to learn about the output-based pricing system and related regulations, because it's not all that simple. And we have the benefit of an expert, well, two experts on this subject from the Pembina Institute. Did I pronounce that right, by the way?
I like how you say it.
Pembina, you like it? Okay. Which you probably all know is a very respected Canadian think tank that advises on energy policy and environmental policy. Now, and you are all muted. Everyone's muted, but you can talk to us through the chat line. That's a little cloud, a little bubble at the bottom of your screen. If you click on that, then you see the chat screen come down the right-hand side. It's something's happening. I'm not sure what it is, but there's a group chat line. Nice and nice. Wow. This is going out of control. But anyway, let me continue in introducing Isabelle. I have a short story here. I know Isabelle doesn't mind this as to how we invited her. It's because Kathy said, you know, we got to hear from an expert about this subject. Very complex. Now, as it happened, about a week earlier, I had come across on the internet a letter which Isabelle Turcotte had sent to Environment Canada and Climate Change Canada 2 years ago, which gave prodigious comment on the output-based pricing system, very detailed, with a whole section on electricity, which was really questioning whether electricity should be part of the regulation at all. So I thought, right away, that's my expert. That's the one that I want to be here. And so I asked her, pretty pleased, and I'm very, very happy that Isabelle agreed to join us tonight. And I'm very happy that you have joined us, each individual you, because it is possible, depending on how this goes or how CCL managed to figure this out in the end, this could be a very good opportunity to reduce GHG emissions in Canada. There is a potential, let's say, which I'm going to bring out in a few minutes now, to reduce emissions. And I'm going to lead into that by showing a couple of graphs. So let me show this one. Does anyone see? Oh, should I show this one? No matter what you do to prepare for this. Lynn Adamson wants to come in. Does anyone see a graph on the screen?
I'll handle that, John. Don't worry, or Kathy will do it. Don't worry about those.
Oh, I guess I'm looking for my first graphs on Ontario.
It's not on the screen yet, John. Oh, here it is. Okay.
Oh, here it is. There it is. There it is. All right then. So this data is from Actually, the whole format is from the Canada Energy Regulator, but I did check that this data was actually pretty consistent with the Independent Electricity System Operator in Ontario. It's their forecast of it's not exactly a forecast, one should more rightfully call it a scenario for the amount of generation, as you can see, in gigawatt hours per year from different types of fuel. So what does you see? I'm going to try the Socratic method here a little bit, although I don't see my chat line. I was going to ask, does anyone see what particular type of fuel will be declining in the portion of electricity which it produces in Ontario over the next 10 years or so? You see that? And could you enter that in the chat line? I don't see any chat line on my screen. Whoa. This has gone askew a bit. Does everyone see? Does everyone get the chat line? Can anyone see a chat line?
One vote for Cole so far.
Coal? Yeah, that's declined. That is definitely declined. Something else though has already declined by 2014, but over the next decade, from about now through to the end of 2030, actually. Is everyone getting that?
Solar, wind, and 2 votes for hydro.
Wow, this is not working. Don't you see that the purple patch in the middle? Maybe it's hard to see because it's stuck in the middle. Don't you see that is declining quite a bit? Do you see
I
that?
can't see the legend, which may be causing some problems. I don't know if others can.
Oh, really? Is that a legend coming up on the screen at the bottom of the graph?
It was for a minute, but it's not now. You've got there. Good. That's it.
You
Thank
can
you.
see it.
Okay, you see, does everyone see the legend now?
Nuclear now. Yeah, now that the legend is clear, the vote is nuclear.
All righty. Now, what is it being replaced by? Any votes on that? Is it being replaced by renewable energy by any chance? Does it look like this government we have planning to install some more renewable energy over the next few years?
Sadly, the vote is for gas. John?
Yeah, yes. So, and I'm going to move on. I can't spend all day. We're going to move out west to Alberta. Does everyone see a legend now? And a graph of generation in Alberta. And I'm going to ask the same question. There is a particular fuel which is scheduled to decline as a contributor to the total electricity generation. What is that? You know, even if it's obvious, can you play along with me by voting on the chat line? Because I can't see this. The chat
Clearly,
line. for some
Cole,
reason.
John.
Is it
Cole.
coal? Yeah. Now,
Mhm.
is there a lot of renewable energy planned here in Alberta? Does it look like Alberta is going to install renewable energy to a degree, to any degree?
Wind. Yep.
There's some wind, yeah.
Mhm.
And of course, I understand Alberta is quite a windy sort of place. Do you see my cursor by any chance?
Yes.
And there's a tiny, teeny, weeny, itsy bitsy bit of solar, which is coming on in Alberta, which we've read about, but in total volume of gigawatt hours. So what's taking the lion's share in Alberta? What is projected according to, let's say, conventional wisdom at this point in time?
Gas. Everyone's
Yeah.
saying gas.
Yes, yes, yeah. Okay, okay. Now, I'm not going to go through the other provinces, but there's two other provinces, Saskatchewan and Nova Scotia, that have a very somewhat similar picture to this, although they're on a smaller scale. Because I'm going to move straight through to Canada. This is all of the data put together for Canada. Does everyone see that graph with the legend?
Yep.
Yeah. And now what shows the coal phase out here and hydro, gas, nuclear, wind. What appears to be increasing, according to this, increasing the most over the next couple of years. Let's see if that's visually obvious to everyone. Is
Gas.
that,
Gas.
people voting? Yes, yes,
Yeah,
yes,
yes.
yes, yeah. Okay, so I'm gonna, I don't have all the right, oh, there it is. I'm gonna stop sharing for a minute so you can see me, except I see Laura for some reason. Don't seem to be able to put myself on anyway. You know, there's a great, there's another energy advisor that I know of who's called Mark Turcotte, who's a professor at Simon Fraser University. And he's recently written this book. It's a pity I'm not on the full screen here, but The Citizen's Guide to Climate Success. And in several of his other writings, he points out that there is one sector which should be the easiest, which should be the very first one to decarbonize. It should be the easiest, the least cost. And in fact, he said he's done some work, he's got some work coming out saying there'll be very little cost in totally decarbonizing this particular sector in Canada. What would that be? Can anyone take a wild guess what sector he's talking about? Is any people playing along with this, Sharon? Are they voting?
Right at the moment.
No? There's a sector, you know, the different sectors, electricity, transportation.
Electricity is getting votes right now.
Okay. Anyway, psychotic method is dragging things out of people. Maybe the questions are too obvious, which is good because it's very obvious that we all want to decarbonize electricity, but it's not quite happening, is it? You know, it's in fact, I mean, I don't want to mislead you. Electricity is looks like electricity is going to give us some kind of emission reduction by 2030, and that's just by shutting down the coal plants. But this is like a frustrating game of whack-a-mole, you know, where you punch the emissions down by about 40 million tons by shutting down coal, but then the gas pops up with about another 22 million tons. These are calculations I've done from this data. And that's by 2030, when Canada was supposed to had a goal of 10% non-emitting to get 10% of its electricity from non-emitting sources by 2030. That's one commitment of Canada. But I mean, just look at this, by 2040, the amount of emissions from gas, and I'm only talking about the stack emissions, are about half as much again as the emissions that we've decreased from shutting down coal. Now, this shows the energy output, but it's fairly easy to estimate the emissions using standards, which you're going to hear about in a few minutes. And the gas, it's heading by 2040. This is, you know, 10 years from when we're supposed to be at zero emissions. We have emissions from the gas plants half as much again as what we actually save from the coal plants. So, is this cool or uncool? But, and now I just want to say this is only a scenario, of course. It's not really a forecast. It's a scenario, they say, like the IEA says it has, you know, its current policy scenario, its stated policy scenario. This, I would suppose, is a current policy scenario. It's a mirror of what someone has figured out should happen based on current policies, which are, you know, not laws of physics. They can be changed, and that's why we're here tonight, which is a good leading to our guest, Isabelle, to please explain some of these laws and regulations. Over to you, Isabelle.
Thanks, John. All right, I am going to be sharing my screen with you guys so you can follow the presentation. You should now see the first slide titled Carbon Pricing in the Electricity Sector. And before I start, I just want to say thank you to our hosts, John, Sharon, Kathy, for the invitation to chat with you today. It's a pleasure to be with you. And I also want to quickly introduce and acknowledge the participation of my colleague Nichole Dusyk on today's call, who very generously agreed to join me, lend us some of her time and join me, as I've spent a lot of time on the carbon pricing file, but she holds a lot of knowledge and expertise on the electricity file specifically. So together, I'm hopeful that we can field as many questions as possible. So let's get to it. Here we go. So over the course of this presentation, I'm going to touch on the following topics. So we're gonna introduction to Canada's approach to carbon pricing as part of setting the context for our more technical conversation. Then we're gonna talk about the specific element of carbon pricing for heavy emitters, and then jump into a subset of the system for heavy emitters as it relates to the electricity sector. And then we're going to finish our conversation by talking about some of the non-carbon pricing levers that can help us meet our objective of reducing emissions from the electricity sector. Because of course, the OBPS, the Federal Carbon Pricing System for Heavy Emitters, is the lever that I think John and you guys were most interested in discussing, and it is a powerful one, but it's important to, I think it's valuable as well to take this lever into consideration in a broader context and suite of tools that we can use. All right. Okay. So in this first slide, essentially, I just want to share that carbon pricing was, as you might know, is part of our first ever National Climate Action Plan that was developed by the federal government and in coordination with provinces across the country in 2016. And it is important to note that at that time, 80% of Canadians lived in a province that had already put a price on pollution. So the federal government was really banking on the fact that they could leverage these successes. They could leverage the provinces that had successfully applied carbon pricing and just make sure that it was going to be applied to the 20% of other Canadians that lived in provinces that didn't apply it yet. They were not expecting the political conversation to evolve the way that it did, which is important because some of the challenges that we're going to discuss later on, you know, why one national standard is kind of a challenging thing to have with regards to electricity, given the provincial diversity of the energy mix. That's a situation that they were not thinking they'd have to face, and that we unfortunately have to contend with. So what the federal government said to the other provinces that didn't have their carbon pricing system yet is, you guys have flexibility. You can design your own system, or you can apply the system that we're going to develop. And so the federal system was very much designed in the same way that the Alberta system was designed. It had already been put in place, which is a straight levy on carbon, and then, so a carbon tax, and then an element for our heavy emitters. This is what was in Alberta. This is what the federal government decided to do for their approach. And as part of Canada's approach to pricing pollution, the federal government said we are going to review our path we're going to review our performance every 5 years and revise our system according to how we're doing. Are we meeting our objectives? And I mention this because the review process is a really important moment to get in the conversation and try to influence the stringency of the system. So in 2020, we have a midterm review that's happening, and that's very focused on the emission intensive and trade exposed element of the system. So our conversation is really timely, and your goal of lobbying for a stronger OBPS is also very timely. And then there's going to be a full review in 2022. All right, so why is there a separate component for heavy emitters? Why do they warrant their own carbon pricing system? The rationale for this, and it is appropriate, is that we don't want to end up in a scenario where, as a result of our climate policies, we do not generate any environmental benefits, either domestically or globally, and we lose economic gains. So the scenario that we're trying to avoid is if you put too high of a price on carbon on a heavy emitter, they might decide to move to a jurisdiction that is not currently pricing emissions. Who knows? They might be producing their goods in a very dirty grid, and so our emissions are increasing globally, and Canada has lost that production. So it's finding that just balance. The whole rationale for an output-based pricing system is to find that right balance between protecting the competitiveness, avoiding that leakage, which is what I just described, but making sure that there is a price signal, there is an incentive to continue to gradually to reduce your emissions and get your economic and your environmental benefit. And so under the federal system, the output-based pricing system applies to effectively emission intensive and trade exposed sectors. But the way that the federal government has defined this is facilities that emit above a certain quantity of emissions annually. And as I just mentioned, the goal is to provide a relief from the carbon levy. And what that looks like practically is that if I'm a facility that emits more than 50 kilotons a year, and I make, for example, cement, I will be paying the full price on pollution, but only on a certain fraction of my emissions. And the way that that's calculated, so this is really important. So I'm just going to spend a minute or two on the concept of how do we set an output-based standard and the concept of the output-based standard, because it's really key to, are we striking that right balance? That's one of the main design elements of an output-based pricing system that allows us to strike that right balance, as I was mentioning. So the way that the federal government has approached setting an output-based standard is they look at one sector. For example, I'm going to stick with the cement manufacturing sector. And let's imagine that in that sector, there's facility A, B, C, D, E, F. And they each emit a certain level of tons of carbon per tons of cement produced. That's their emission intensity. So we see facility F emits much higher tons of carbon per ton of product than facility A. Facility A is doing really well, performing very well environmentally. So what we do is we look at what is the national average for that sector. This is our dashed line. And then we set a standard, which is an emission intensity standard that's below this national average emission intensity. So that is the output-based standard. That's the standard to which that each facility should strive to meet in order to actually not have to pay a price on pollution. Because if you're below the standard, you don't pay the price on any percentages of your emissions. If you're above the standard, you pay the price on that portion above. Now, an important thing to keep in mind is that facility A, B, who are below the standard, still have an incentive to even do better, which is really key. because if they continue to reduce their emissions, they are able to generate credits that they can sell, hence the incentive. They can sell to folks who are above the standard. So there's a dynamic there that ensures that across the board, even if you're below or above the standard, you still have an incentive to increase your environmental performance, so to decrease your emissions. All right, now moving into the specific treatment of electricity emissions under the federal carbon pricing system for heavy emitters, which is called our output-based pricing system. As John mentioned, there was when the federal government first announced that it was going to be developing a heavy emitter system in a carbon levy as part of its approach to pricing pollution, they did not mention that electricity was going to be included. This only came later and generated quite a strong reaction among the environmental NGOs and the renewable electricity folks. We just did not think it was appropriate or justified, and that it would actually create a barrier to reaching our goals of 90% non-emitting electricity by 2030. Because electricity is neither by definition or necessity emission intensive, and it is not trade exposed. There are some trades, there's some exports to the US, but it's not like hydro, or it's not like there's going to be a power plant that's going to move to the US. So unfortunately, so this is the spoiler alert here. Unfortunately, so this was the beginning of the consultation, and then we fought hard, and then at the end of the consultations, we did not get everything we wanted. And a lot of the justification from the federal government side was that they made a lot of efforts to reduce emissions from the electricity sector through their coal regulations and their natural gas regulations. And the standards that were set under the output-based pricing system was sort of meant to acknowledge this and safeguard, if you will, those gains, which of course needs to be understood as not wanting to add additional burden on regulated utilities. All right, and so another element of justification, of course, is that the federal government wanted to avoid very, very much any increase in the price of electricity in provinces where their systems would be put in place. And so, of course, for politicians and folks who live in Ontario are very aware of this. The price of electricity is a very delicate issue and is a huge political vulnerability. All right, and on this next slide, I'm not going to go into the details, but I just wanted to make sure that we were taking into consideration the existing regulations in the electricity sector as we think about how to increase our levers to reduce emissions. Because the standards that we have been able to get through the output-based pricing system were influenced by those regulations. So just quickly, the federal government implemented a coal phase out, and that's actually a big win for climate policy and has important repercussions globally. We're able to be leaders and to encourage through our own leadership here at home other nations across the globe to also phase out coal, which is a huge source of emissions. So wonderful, we have a coal phase out policy where effectively by 2029 we're not going to have coal plants running anymore. And then we have also regulations for new natural gas that set an emission standard for those new units. And those standards under both regulations are, you have to meet them. They're regulated under CEPA, so it's not the same kind of standard under the output-based pricing system where you're not going to jail if you do not meet it. You just pay the price on pollution. Okay, so on this slide, I am looking at how the different provinces have, what kind of standard they have set for electricity emissions. And so Yeah, well, so let's look at this. Let's start with, so BC is doing a great job. BC essentially has not included electricity in an output-based pricing system. They paid a full price. Alberta, we're just going to look at the second Alberta column because the previous column is the system that's not in place anymore. It's the old system for heavy emitters. So but the new system maintained the same standard, which is great, but it doesn't have a tightening rate. So that means that the output-based pricing, the output-based standard does not decline over time. And so, as you probably know, in Ontario, which is our next column, the federal carbon pricing system is in place, but Ontario has nonetheless developed its own pricing system for heavy emitters, and we know that they are hoping that they could be approved and that their system can replace the federal system, which is something that we would want to avoid for the sake of policy certainty and for the sake of having a stronger, specifically in the electricity sector, a stronger standard in place than what Ontario is proposing. Same thing for New Brunswick. So New Brunswick's system is even weaker than what the Ontario government has proposed. And in that province, similarly to Ontario, we would hope that the federal system would stay in place. And then finally, we have the standards for the federal system for our electricity emissions. So let's see, I'm just wondering what level of detail we should go into with these standards. I guess you could say that Alberta system, let me switch to the other slide. I think I explained this here. So sorry, on this slide, we're seeing the evolution of the different standards per electricity source put forward by the different provinces, which you can it's like a nice visual summary of what's happening. And it seems pretty clear, like New Brunswick system is the weakest. We could see the standards are highest and stay the same until 2030. That doesn't drive reductions. But I think more interestingly here in this table is a little bit of the summary of the weakness in every province for what they put forward on their electricity system and how to make it better. So, Alberta does create a level playing field by applying just one standard for across the electricity sector. So as opposed to the federal system, we have a standard for coal, a standard for gas, and a standard for diesel. And so that does not create a level playing field. Essentially, you're giving a stronger subsidy to coal than you are to gas. And coal being a higher emitting source of electricity generation, that sort of is counterintuitive to what we want to achieve. So what we're suggesting for Alberta is as one element or one way to make a more stringent system and drive more renewable energy into the grid and avoid the dash to gas, which is indeed a real risk in Alberta, is to implement a tightening rate. So where we have our one standard of 370 that goes down to 0 eventually. In Ontario, so as I mentioned, the best way is just to keep the federal system in place. Same for New Brunswick. I don't know if folks have questions about the specific standards, like the level at which they were set. We can answer that, but I think what might be sort of more interesting is those high-level takeaways on this next slide in terms of how to enhance the federal output-based pricing system. In the previous slide, I made some very quick recommendations on how we could enhance the provincial ones or avoid having weaker ones at least by maintaining the federal system. And then on this slide, I'd just like to share a few high-level recommendations on what could be things that we could do to enhance the federal system. So obviously, a very simple avenue is to just take electricity out of our output-based pricing system and apply apply the price on pollution to all emissions. And you know, we can talk about the concern of raising electricity tariffs, and we could say we can manage that by, you know, we're going to have increased revenues if we price all emissions, and we can redistribute these to households. We could implement energy efficiency projects, which not only deliver greenhouse gas benefits, but also reduce the electricity bill. A second recommendation, so sort of, you know, in our series of positions as the negotiations went forward, these are the positions that we took at Pembina, where, okay, oh no, sorry, this next recommendation was not, sorry, different thing. A very simple one, and one that needs to happen, is to continue to increase the price of carbon beyond 2022. So as you might know, the federal government has committed to increasing their price by $10 a ton annually, but just until 2022. And during the election, they were very cautious of not taking a position or making a commitment when as to where the carbon price would go after 2022. And then now, post-election, and having been, you know, elected on a clear mandate to increase ambition, now is the time for them to say, okay, here's how the price will continue to increase. And it could increase beyond $10 annually, right? It could go to 20, it could go, like, those are questions that we have to look at. What's the right level of increase? And then, so back to what I was saying earlier in terms of the series of positions that we took as sort of consultations advanced on the output-based pricing system. Unfortunately, taking electricity out was not taken, but now maybe we can bring this back on the table. But a second position could be to increase the tightening rate for coal and coal to gas. So we do have an output-based standard for coal and coal to gas plants that starts at 800 and goes down gradually, not to 0, but it goes down to 370, which is best in class for a converted plant. So that's good, but we could do more. Maybe we could have a tightening rate that goes down faster. And then the last recommendation is to have a tightening rate for existing gas plants, because right now, under the current regulations, the rate stays the same at 370, which again is a good standard. It is a sort of represents best in class for gas plants, but because it doesn't go down, it doesn't provide that sort of increasing incentive across or through time. But, and this is not on my slide here, but it is important to note that the declining standard that we were able to obtain, and this is sort of collaborative work from the environmental organizations and the renewable energy associations and health groups that work together to advocate for a really strong outcome on new gas plants. And we did get it. So we did get a standard that declined to 0. So effectively that was a big win, and it does make sure that the economics for new gas plants are not very favorable, and that they are going to be, it creates a good context for renewable energy projects instead. Yeah, so those are some high level recommendations that I think, you know, it's obviously it's up to your group to have conversations amongst yourselves in terms of what are the levers that you want to pull. We can discuss these further if you'd like. But on this next slide, I just want to give some space for Nichole to briefly introduce some non-pricing levers that could also be put in place in parallel.
Yes, thank you. And I'll just be very brief because I want to leave time for questions. So, you know, obviously pricing is one way that we can try and avoid the dash to gas. We can try to price it out by increasing the price of carbon intensive gas, electricity. But there are other ways, which I'm sure many of you are quite well aware of. But one of them would be to make better use of our resources regionally. So better connecting our provincial grids to make use of hydro resources, and then also to support renewables through the effective battery capacity that comes from large hydro. So basically optimizing across regions so that we can support more renewables and then also help deal with some of the variability of those renewables. Now also, electricity is regulated at the provincial level. And so there are ways, like key levers are influencing and adjusting how the regulatory approach at the provincial level. Now, there's a couple ways that can happen. One of them would be to think about the additional services that renewables can provide. So things like, for instance, storage can provide services in the way of frequency regulation and other grid-related services. And so valuing them not just from the energy that they produce, but from those other services. And then also thinking about what would be called value stacking. So packaging renewable or different resources together and seeing them as collective resources that can be valued at a higher rate when they're packaged together, like solar plus storage. The other approach that we could take then would be to look at the aspirational targets. At the federal level, it's an aspirational target. It could be more binding at the provincial level. But currently, the federal government has an aspirational target of having 90% non-emitting electricity by 2030. That target could increase. We actually are on track to meet that. And I would say absolutely have the capacity to exceed it. But then that could also be scaled down as well to the provincial level. And so advocating at the provincial level for clean energy targets that would then push and prioritize particular forms of generation beyond, you know, the absolute cost of that generation. So I'll leave it there, and I'm sure you all have lots of questions about what Isabelle presented, because that's some pretty meaty subjects. So we'll leave it there so that you have a chance to ask your questions.
Okay, let me come back. Can everyone hear me? That's great. I guess it took us longer to get going. That's partly my fault here. But I'm hoping that Sharon and Laura will have picked up some questions, and I'm going to ask them to go forward. I'm not sure if they've decided to do it one by one. I'm just is Sharon asking to be unmuted? No. You can unmute yourself, can't you, Sharon?
I guess I could. Well,
okay, go ahead.
There were a couple of questions that have come up. I think it's if we go back to the question of the principles around how electricity was regulated. I think Tom had a question about why, you know, whether there was a good example of electricity actually having having any kind of leakage prevention. Are you aware of any studies which compare various leakage prevention mechanisms?
Yeah, that's a good question. And actually, you know, I want to word this cautiously, but the design or the that there is a test that the federal government has for assessing the emission intensity and this trade exposure, so the degree to which a sector is both emission intensive and trade exposed. It's sort of a grid, and based on where you fall on the grid, your sector warrants a higher or lower level of protection to avoid the competitiveness risks and those leakage risks. And so that test was applied, and it's something that was actually taken from Alberta when they developed their output-based pricing system a few years ago. But the electricity sector, its inclusion is not justified by this test. It was more of a political decision than one that was warranted by this test. And so for me, that is definitely an argument in favor of taking it out, while also putting in place measures to address those risks of increasing electricity tariffs. Because I think, it would be a shame indeed if the policy came under attack as it did. We had a big battle during the election where carbon pricing was seen or was being portrayed as increasing the burden of the cost of living for Canadians. And we know that's not true when we understand the details of how revenues are redistributed in a very progressive way to protect against that. But it would be a shame if, for sort of political opportunism, one opponent of this system would be able to once again sort of grab a hold of that affordability narrative. So I would say, yes, let's advocate for the electricity sector to be taken out, but let's put in place those measures to ensure that the electricity tariffs don't go up.
Thank you. I guess, Tom had another question, which is related to the Supreme Court rulings that we understand have been actually delayed, but he wondered if there was a chance that a decision in favor of the federal government's jurisdiction would result in a likelihood that electricity would be moved out of the special treatment. Do you have a perspective on that?
Yeah, that's interesting. I guess it would set a very, very good precedent, right, in terms of the federal government's ability, their jurisdiction to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. That's for sure. And if we can put this battle to rest, if we can put this unfortunate political debate to rest, we can move along, constructively towards, increasing ambition on climate. And if the conversation becomes a more rational one again, maybe it's easier to talk about how to have a better design when it's not under political attack. So yeah, I think the sort of post Supreme Court decision is going to be conducive to having more rational conversations about getting a better design.
I guess I don't know, John, do you see anything else in the chat that we can feature to kind of bring out the conversation?
Kathy,
Question,
Kathy, if I'm going to say so, I think Kathy, I saw a question from Kathy about the increase in the price of electricity. Mm-hmm. And I think it's very important to distinguish between a province like Ontario, in which gas is never more than 20% of the total supply. So for example, I did a calculation based on my own electricity bill. And let's say, and I think the point Isabelle was making is the tax is actually not a cost. The tax is just money going around in a circle. The real cost will be if the tax prompts people to put in a more expensive alternative. Like for example, in Alberta, they've recently contracted for wind and solar at about 5 cents per kilowatt hour. Now, I've calculated that the running cost of an existing plant, incremental cost, just of the gas, is only about 2 cents a kilowatt hour. So,
Yeah,
that would be an increase of 3 cents a kilowatt hour, but that's on less than 20% of the volume. So the weighted average of that is, you know, a fifth of that, which is 0.05 cents or something. And my total bill, and it's important when you talk about electricity costs to distinguish exactly what cost are you talking about. And I think the most meaningful cost is the total cost of everything: electricity, distribution, regulatory charges, the HST, the rebate, and everything. And I pay on that basis about 23 cents a kilowatt hour. So I figured out that if Ontario brought in renewable energy instead of oil and gas, it would increase my electricity bill by less than a cup of coffee at Tim Hortons per month.
yeah.
Now that's a different story in Alberta, though.
So John,
That's where the problem
that's a good
is.
point.
Sorry?
That's a good point. That's a good point, right? It's not a one-to-one ratio in terms of a $1 tax, just to simplify, creates a $1 increase in your electricity bill. That's for sure. But, you know, I think that decision makers at the federal level were really trying to avoid having an electricity tariff increase in one province caused by, you know, it could be a variety of factors, be used by their opponents to point to their system as the culprit. So that's sort of the dynamic that maybe I would not have taken into consideration before starting these conversations, and that is an unfortunate reality. But then, you know, it's sort of you can't, the objective of a pricing system is to make fossil fuel is to make fossil fuels or emissions more expensive, right? That's the goal. It's by putting a price signal, we consume less. So, yeah.
So have we any other questions? I just noticed the clock. I can't believe it's about 5 to 8. And we did have a poll. I forgot. Did we announce that poll at the beginning? I'm not sure that we did. I know Kathy has a poll that we're going to take. Are you still there, Kathy?
Of course. Maybe have one more question and we could take the poll at the end.
All right. Okay. One more question.
Perhaps we could take a question from Jeffrey Levitt. He wants to understand a little bit more about how the federal output-based pricing system differs from an emissions trading cap and trade regime for carbon pricing. Can we get a bit of insight on that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So with a cap and trade, which was an option, it was a design option that provinces could choose. You have certainty on the number of reductions that you're going to get because we're capping emissions, but you don't have certainty on the price because the offsets are traded on the market. And then in the output-based pricing system, there's no certainty in terms of how many reductions you're going to get, but you have a certainty on the price. So just different approaches, I would say. You know, carbon pricing comes in all shapes and sizes, and often it's about, for decision makers, it's about which approach will be most politically palatable to your regulated entities to be able to get the system just implemented, and that's what Quebec decided to go forward with, and later Ontario had joined them. And I mean, depending on who you link up with, you do have access to a bigger market of offsets. So Quebec and California were able to benefit from that bigger market as well. But of course, Quebec doesn't have the problem of a high emitting grid.
Well, Kathy, is it time for a poll, or John?
I hate to say so, but I guess, we said it would go to 8 o'clock and you don't like to go over because it makes me, I mean, I could spend all night talking about this, but in deference to, in consideration of our guests, I think we should wrap it up. I think they both laid it out for us very well. I think it was very, very educational, I'm sure, to a lot of people.
So,
And I think we're ready for this poll, just to get the flavor for what people think out there. If Kathy could run that poll for us, please.
Hope the wording's okay.
Right, yeah, that'll do. So what do we do here to vote? How do we vote? Anyone know?
you click on the yes or the no or the not sure.
Oh, you click on that. Oh, okay.
And then submit at the bottom.
So we will be lobbying both provincially and federally, well, most likely provincially and definitely federally at the end of November. And this is going to help us immensely on how to refine what we're asking for. Now got a better understanding, Isabelle and Nichole and John and Sharon and Linda. Thank you so much for this evening.
I'm glad.
Yes, I'm way more convinced, not convinced, but that we should do it, but how we can do it now that you've given us a base. So thank you.
Yeah.
Great.
And
Sure.
Thank you.
fantastic.
Yeah.
What are the results of the poll?
Oh, it was everyone but one said, I'm gonna share, I'm sharing them. There you go. There we go. Not everybody voted. So, yeah.
93%.
If I may, and I know that you guys know the power that you have, but there's this one little story that always comes back to me during GR meetings with ECCC. We're often told that they don't hear from Canadians and they don't feel like they have that pressure to be more ambitious. So every meeting that you have, every opportunity that you have to say, we do want more ambitious policies and regulations is really important. So what you're doing is super important.
Well, thank you. So for when we lobby in late November, I'm sure this will be added to our leave behind. And looking forward to having some helpers with that. And thank you so much, Isabelle, Nichole, and John. That was amazing. I'm going to stop the recording.
Bye-bye, everyone.